Right, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. My name's Aziz Ziriat. I am Head of School Partnerships here at the Brilliant Club. And it's great to welcome you all today to join us for this webinar where we'll be sharing some research and strategies around embedding assessment practices within cognitively challenging learning environments. And we're very pleased to welcome our colleagues and friends at NACE, the National Association for Able Children in Education, who'll be joining us today to share some research from their own network of schools and school leaders. And as an independent charity, NACE works with schools, education leaders, practitioners and policymakers to improve provision for more able learners, driving whole school improvement and raising standards in provision for all. And I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Anne Mccarthy, who will be leading the webinar this afternoon. And just to introduce Anne, Anne has worked at NACE since 2017, currently in the role of Research and Development Director. Until recently, Anne was the Education Director for a multi-academy trust, working with primary and secondary school leaders to raise standards, identify opportunities for innovation, development and training, and to raise aspirations and develop inter-academy collaboration. With over 40 years of experience, her career has included teaching leadership in both primary and secondary schools, including selective and comprehensive education. She has a wide experience of leadership, coaching, and including work as a primary consultant head teacher. She provides advice, training, leadership on quality of education, school curriculum, self-evaluation standards, and school improvement. Anne's doctorate in educational research and development focused on leadership development and its impact on teaching and learning. She maintains research interests in the provision of high quality learning experiences, including all aspects of curriculum, leadership and provision for more able pupils. So we're very grateful to draw on Anne's wealth of experience here today. But before I hand over, I just want to say a huge thank you to those who are able to join us on what I'm sure is a busy week for all. And it's great to see so many colleagues joining us from right the way across the country as well, which is fantastic. And if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat while I run through some kind of general housekeeping rules for the webinar. And just to start with, just to let you know that this meeting is being recorded for the purpose of sharing with any attendees who weren't able to make this session. But please don't let that hinder your confidence in sharing your thoughts and experiences throughout. And we really love to hear from you. And you can do that using, like I said, that handy chat function at the bottom of your screen. You should have a kind of speech bubble that you'll be able to click on. So please do introduce yourselves, where you're from, and what your role is. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Yes, please also do update your name on Zoom to accurately reflect who you are. This really helps us with kind of tracking attendance and following up the relevant resources after the event. And you can do that by clicking on your participant name. As I mentioned, that chat function is live, and I'd really like to encourage you to use that as we go throughout this presentation. We have tried to make this session interactive, so there will be chances to get involved in some polls and some opportunities for kind of breakout discussions and reflection later on in this session as well. So if any questions and thoughts do come up as you go along, please pop those in the chat and we'll try and come back to those at the end. Fantastic. Wonderful. Well, what I'd like to do now is briefly pass over to the Brilliant Club's very own Dr. Lauren Balera, Chief Impact and Strategy Officer. I'll be opening the webinar by briefly discussing some metacognitive strategies and how we measure them on our Scholars Programme, before passing over to Anne, who's going to share some further insights from NACE. So without further ado, Lauren, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Aziz, and a big welcome to everybody. It's lovely to see so many people with us on the webinar this afternoon. And so what I'm going to do is just give a very brief bit of background into metacognition, sort of both from the research perspective, but also talking a little bit about some of the work that we do at the Brilliant Club. And then, as Aziz says, I will then hand over to Anne, who will then be leading the remainder of the webinar. And so this, I mean, I feel like everybody who's on this webinar will already very, very strongly feel this, that we know that metacognition is a really, really important learning outcome, and that it's got really, really strong links with school progression and school attainment. And so we see this from evidence such as the Education Endowment Foundation. And so we know it's something really important, and we know it's something which we should be developing in our students. And then sort of within that, there's a really interesting conversation about the particular subjects that are particularly well versed to metacognition. And sort of there's some really interesting research on this, but sort of really the overall consensus is that you are able to apply metacognitive principles across the school curriculum and across different subjects, which is positive. And so what I'm going to do before we move on to the next slide is a really quick poll, just to get a sense from people about where they're currently at with regards to using metacognition in the classroom. And so I'm just going to pause there for a moment. And I think it's you're, there we go, perfect, you're bringing up the poll. And so we'll just give people 30 seconds or so. I think we can probably close it now, and we can see what the data looks like. Interesting. Okay, so I'd say we've got a mixture overall, which I think is positive, and I think will make some of the later discussions particularly informative. And so the majority of people, say 50%, sort of say they're somewhat confident, which I think is quite a good place to be in. Okay, so we just move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is really kind of more the research and a little bit of a theoretical overview. So I think some of the kind of difficulties in and around metacognition is that it's very closely connected with other outcomes. And so we talk about things like critical thinking, for example, in the connection across different cognitive outcomes. And then within that, and certainly within the metacognition literature, there's a lot of definitions. And so I think being really, really clear what we're talking about when we're talking about metacognition, and in particular what the different elements of metacognition include. And so broadly, we can talk about it in kind of these different categories. And so we talk about the knowledge about strategies, and so the knowledge about particular study strategies. And I know that this is something which Anne will talk about later in the webinar about different approaches and practical strategies to improving metacognition. And then we also talk about kind of your awareness as a learner. And so your knowledge about what works for you as a learner, and thinking about the different factors that influence your performance. And then thinking about the knowledge under which you're able to successfully use and apply different strategies, and both sort of cognitive strategies and also metacognitive strategies. And again, what we'll do later on in the webinar is we'll kind of draw out the distinction between the two. And then sort of over all of this in the yellow box, and it's very kind of cyclical in nature. It's kind of going through the process of that kind of initial planning, and then the monitoring whilst you're using a particular strategy, and then the evaluation. And so this is sort of the kind of meta overall approach. And then what we will do is I say we, but Anne in particular with her areas of expertise, will sort of talk through some practical ways to sort of use these things and apply these things in a classroom. Okay, so we just move on to the next slide. Okay, so I won't spend too long on this slide. I think often when we talk about metacognition, I think it does feel a little bit abstract. And so I just wanted to give a very concrete example of if you were getting somebody to think of think through metacognitive processes, like what would it look like? And so this is an example in maths, for example, but also it would also look very similar for other curriculum subjects as well. And also what we'll do after the webinar is we will circulate the slides. And I'd recommend the blog at the bottom of the page, which sort of talks about this in a bit more detail, and I think is particularly interesting. And then see to feature perfect. And so this is really just making a little bit of a connection to the work that we do at the Brilliant Club, and sort of in particular our flagship Access program, the Scholars program. And so this is a program which is focused on what we call super curricular content. And so a PhD researcher from a university working with a group of students from a school. And the PhD tutor is teaching those students about the PhD topic and about their research and all of the weird and wonderful things that they learn. And then it's delivered through a series of university-style tutorials. And then the program is top-entailed with, both with trips to universities, and in particular competitive universities. And then also we get the students to complete a baseline and a final assignment. And so it's easy, we just go on to my final slide. And so this is just a really brief example of something, and we're doing many activities and many things within the Scholars program, but just a particular example of an activity that we use, which is really centered on developing metacognition. And so what we do is we use this in and around the final assignment. And what we're asking students to do is to think about the different strategies and different approaches they're using, and to reflect on and to evaluate essentially the effectiveness. And so whether they're able to do particular aspects of metacognition. And then what we do is this is then sent to the PhD tutor. And then that forms the basis of a really meaningful and important feedback conversation about where students are performing in relation to different areas, but also whether they're able to do the application of the particular metacognitive strategies. And again, I'll just finish with and say that it's a cyclical process, and it's something that students will need to go through time and time again. Okay, so on that note, I will hand over to Anne, who will be leading us through the rest of the webinar.
Sorry, thank you very much. First learning, more able person, and then couldn't remember to press the mute button to speak. But I'm very pleased to speak with you today. For those, I noticed as schools were coming on, there are quite a few NACE schools who have joined us today. So some of the things I will say initially, you will recognise the conversation which has been ongoing through NACE. We took a great deal of interest in looking at cognitively challenging learning, and took a case study approach to actually researching into this across the whole group of NACE schools, so that we actually could talk to schools and teachers about what a cognitively challenging learning environment looked like, what we meant by the terms associated with cognitively challenging learning, and most importantly for schools, how we can actually impact learning by specific practices that people have already said we've had success with those. So this year, building on that, we've looked at two specific strands. One is assessment practices within schools, and the other one is language within schools. And the thing I'm going to talk about today is assessment within schools. because one of the things we noticed is that assessment almost got turned on its head throughout the COVID months or years, as it seems like forever, because things that people had said we can't do or we don't do or we're not interested in doing suddenly became part of day-to-day practice. And some of the things we needed to do to measure progress and some of the things we'd held on to for our whole careers had to go out the window. So it's been a perfect opportunity to actually think, well, what's assessment all about within this environment? So if we begin to look at the slides, please. Next slide. So what I'm going to look at today, essentially are these 5 separate areas building towards what self-regulation will look like, what it will look like if we actually can build metacognitive challenge, metacognitive learning within our work. So to begin with, I want to look at assessment itself, then how the teacher uses assessment, and then obviously how we then bring that together with the topic of metacognition, because I actually think there's a long way to go on this, and we're just really at this sort of point of beginning to think about metacognition as part of the assessment process, because we've already, as interestingly seen by your data there, we've already really begun to establish metacognition as an understood practice in school, and most have some idea of what's to do, what their understanding of metacognition is. And we're now at the point now, well, actually, how does that look in all aspects of teaching and learning, which is why I want to look at how it links to assessment practices. So if we could have the next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So this is something you've probably all seen before, assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment as learning. And when this slide moves on, I will have another poll for you just to get a sense of where you are. Teach and test content, assessment of learning. It's where I am. It's almost everything that people did when I first started teaching all years ago. It's now very much a part of what we do, but it's not the only part of what we do. So it's important to know, where does that fit? How does it fit into our overall plan for teaching? But the thing we must understand within that is very much teacher controlled. Around 2000, everybody started talking about assessment for learning in a very big way. I can remember that everybody had to have a different way of looking at assessment for learning, different practices within classrooms, and now assessment for learning has the term has almost ceased to use, simply because it's so much part of what we do. Because although it's still teacher-led, we do understand that we're teachers do understand that cognitive strategies are developing, and that assessment is taking place regularly and routinely during the process of learning rather than the impact of the product of learning. And obviously nowadays, the thing we are beginning to look at is how we can develop metacognition, and how does assessment link with that, and how is assessment seen as part of the learning process. And then obviously, how do we hand the ownership of learning to the pupil? So these are the 3 key areas that we think about, and what's the balance within our classroom. So as we move slides, if I could ask you to put up the next poll, please. When you're ready, if we just could look at the hours, please. Okay, so I think I could probably have predicted this is how it's going to look, because the teacher in the classroom is using assessment for learning the majority of time. Assessment of learning is driven by exam boards and the endpoint and Ofsted and school leaders and governors, and those mark books. Many years ago I used to have a mark book which had little squares in it, and it was made of paper, and we had to record everything that happened. And I think that's still very much the case. There's a lot of checks and balances that we need to use, and it's really important that we have assessment of learning, but progress of pupils in their overall development we can actually get more out of it if we can begin to shift towards assessment as a learning process rather than an independent process. Okay, we could remove them. Oh, we've changed the slide. So if you can take, I need to close it myself, I take it. Sorry, can we go back one? That was my fault. I didn't see the slide change. Thank you. So what we're looking for with our assessment is we want learning to be cognitively challenging. And by that, I mean that pupils will meet more complex environments. They will have cognitively more challenging information to manage and manipulate, that they have developed the schemata that sit between areas of knowledge, that they're using knowledge from different areas of learning and bringing it together, that there's a degree of analytical thinking within their work, so that when they're learning, every aspect of their development is growing. And so we need to make sure our assessment design allows that to happen. So obviously the thing is that the teacher needs to know what the pupil already can do, what they need to continue to learn, and the teacher needs to be able to plan for that learning. But the pupil also needs to have information about where they are in the learning journey. It needs to direct their learning. And very importantly is that exposure of misconceptions and gaps in knowledge, because quite often, particularly in secondary, you'll change teachers or you'll change classes and people won't necessarily know where those gaps are or when they appeared. So our assessment processes, and this is why so many are using assessment for learning, is because that's when you are exposing those gaps. And we're doing a lot of work nowadays. It's become a far bigger push now to improve memory and recall and reduce cognitive load. And I've seen far more activities which are within lesson assessments, which actually visit and revisit ideas and facts and vocabulary and knowledge in order to bring that into working memory and reduce cognitive load. And then obviously the thing we really want to do, particularly for our more able, but by thinking about it for all pupils, is getting that deeper learning, beginning to get the pupils to think more deeply about their learning, how they're learning, why they're learning, what they're learning, the process of learning. So those are really important factors. And the one thing that really troubles me around assessment is assessment a bigger part of teaching and learning than the actual teaching and learning process? Is more time being spent on the assessment process between planning for assessment, undertaking assessment, revisiting the outcomes of assessment, feedback, improving performance? Is too much time being spent on that and not enough on the actual process of learning? So I feel that you have to, when you think about assessment, it's the time taken and the power of it should be commensurate with the impact it has on teaching and learning. Next slide, please. So in the wake of that, things for you to think about yourself, because this is not all about me telling you, it's about you having time here to reflect on how you use it. And we've obviously had the first simple question about the nature of assessment, but here I've just thought of some things that you might want to consider when you're actually planning assessment. And it obviously depends where you are. I noticed we've got head teachers, we've got senior leaders, we've got classroom practitioners within our group today. And so your response might be different depending on your role in the school. But, you know, where does your planning for assessment sit? because I feel it's very, very important. And for the most successful schools I've worked with, assessment planning process has the most power, rather than assessment that's responsive to the situation you're in. So often I see teachers trying to do assessment for learning within their lessons. So they'll ask questions within their lessons, or they'll set up tasks within their lessons, which they didn't really think through, or they knew they wanted to do this, but didn't think what the impact would be. And if you actually plan for that impact at the start of the process, you find that they have far greater power in the teaching and learning environment. A very good big question, or a very deep question, or a question that leads to other really good questions, is often stronger, rather than the actual just, oh, this will just do this. You have to think about what that's going to be. So I've seen teachers who come in and a child will say something, and then they ask a few more questions, and it doesn't get to any analytic process or any complex process. Whereas the teacher who plans the assessment into the process of learning might think, actually, these are some really good questions I could ask. According to the ability of the children, I might ask this open-ended question, or I might ask this question where there isn't necessarily a single or clear answer, or there might be opinions related to the answer. There might be a question where I want the youngsters to challenge opinion. So they think that about that question beforehand, and from that very big question come other really strong questions, and they model the nature of that question. So thinking around assessment within the planning really makes a difference to the quality of the assessment itself and the place it has within the learning process. Again, in terms of balancing the nature of the assessments, assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment as learning, all have their place. But are you distinguishing between them, and are you using them for the best outcomes for the pupils? Next slide, please. So going to the other side of this, as teachers, these are the sorts of things we must be really clear about. You know, what we're trying to assess in the first place. So why are we assessing within our lesson or at the end of a series of lessons? How we actually plan to undertake that assessment. Who benefits from it? Is it for the teacher? Is it for somebody you report to? Is it for the benefit of the pupil? When you undertake the assessment, what evidence are you going to have? How are you going to use that evidence? Because just having a set of numbers, or if it's a subject that has objectives, you know, if you get some AOs ticked off, if you have 70% I'm heading for this grade, that's not necessarily as helpful as it can be if we actually know what we're trying to find out. And in a cognitively challenging environment, in an environment where we're trying to develop cognition, we want to also understand what thinking processes we're measuring, what activities we want pupils to be able to do, what they want to be able to draw on in their skill set. Is our evidence coming from the assessment allowing us to interpret that and be able to use that? So once we've got that evidence, how are we using it? Is it just, oh, well, we've done this and now we're going to give them a dirt task so that they take responsibility for the feedback we give them? Or is it clearly we need to know where they are in that learning journey, and we're going to take each pupil individually forward, or we're going to take us a whole forward, or we're going to adapt teaching from it? So it's how we want to use the information. So almost you're planning from the end back to the beginning. You know, what do I want the impact of this information to have on all aspects of teaching, learning and development? How then will I manage to create that information? Where will I get the information from, and therefore what will the assessment look like? So, you know, if you think from the impact to the action and the process that goes between those, then the quality of assessment could be much stronger. Thank you. Next slide. So just some pointers, I think. I just wanted some think points at the end of this. So we want to know what pupils know already. We want to promote cognitive challenge and progression. We want to measure the impact of both the teaching, on the quality of the teaching, the impact of the teaching, but also the learning. We want to be able to adapt practice. So, assessment within the learning process itself allows us to adapt practice within the lesson. Assessment at the end of the process means we have to change practice later on. So we have to time it appropriately to be able to adapt the practice. And obviously we want to extend and enhance learning, particularly for our more able in the sort of complex, challenging environment. And then we want to know how effectively the knowledge can be used. So it's all well and good to acquire the knowledge, it's all well and good to be able to respond to questions which reflect the actual model of teaching. But if we give the pupils different environments, different problems, different contexts, we'll still be able to use the knowledge they've acquired. And how will assessment help us direct our teaching in that way? Thank you. Next slide. So as I said, the beginning was to look at how assessment links to the process of teaching. The next part of this links assessment to improve metacognition. And obviously I'm revisiting now some of the things that Lauren said. Metacognition is about the ways learners monitor and purposely direct their learning. So we're thinking about setting assessment in that environment. So the learners need to be able to monitor their learning, so they need an assessment that they can use, and they need to be able to direct their learning, so they need to know what the assessment is telling them. And they need to develop metacognitive strategies, because rather than the teacher controlling and monitoring cognition, they need to be able to monitor cognition themselves. So they need to be able to check the accuracy of techniques. Lauren spoke about the pupils choosing the correct techniques, understanding. We had the maths example where they understand, these are things I can and can't do, but these are the ways I can approach a problem. These are things I need to be able to do next. So the assessment process needs to give them information that they understand what those techniques are. They need to know how well they've used them in the past. They need to know how useful the strategies are within the task they're undertaking, and they need to know how well they've used it within that task. Learners need to develop those cognitive strategies. So as part of teaching and learning, we need to articulate what those cognitive strategies are. We need to demonstrate them and model them as teachers, and then we need to test their ability to actually use them and provide environments in which they use them, so that they can actually be able to acquire knowledge and complete tasks independently. So the assessment strategies should be designed to improve metacognition. Thank you. Next slide. So highlighting some of the key elements in here, obviously the first thing is pupils' metacognition really is about learners learning about learning, and they have to have really good knowledge of themselves as learners, and the assessment needs to help develop that. The assessment exposes the strategies they need and improves the strategies. So if we're thinking of assessment as a learning process, the assessment contains problems or activities or dialogue, which includes those strategies, really makes those strategies obvious. And in the best classrooms I've seen this, the teacher themselves model the strategies. They then explain to the pupils what that strategy was and why they modeled it and how it was of use, and the environment in which it was best used. And then provide the pupil with tasks which exposes the use of those strategies and it requires the pupil to use them. But actually, we're not only measuring then the response to the question or the product, the final outcome, but we're actually looking at the process of answering a question or engaging in a new task, and do the pupils have the strategies to engage fully. The important thing here is we need a vast range of tasks to make this work well. If you want the repertoire of the pupils to expand, they need to meet different types of learning, and they need to be assessed in different environments. The assessment itself should be then designed that the information it exposes allows the pupils themselves to understand what it's telling them, so that they themselves can plan, monitor and evaluate learning. And we looked at this earlier on in this presentation. Lauren showed us that sort of circular motion between planning, monitoring, evaluating, and the importance that you pick something up and you use it, and if it doesn't work well, you know why it didn't work well, and you can evaluate that and then use something better next time. Yeah, I'm seeing questions coming up. During your breakout session, I will actually look at these questions and answer them. So please continue to drop questions in here, and I will respond to these as when we come to the next part of the presentation. One of the really strongest ways I see teachers making use of assessment, and without it taking time out of learning, is by teaching pupils how to engage in dialogue, having really good dialogic discourse in their class. Within the learning, so pupil-to-pupil talk and pupil-to-teacher talk is a really strong means of assessment in the moment, in the classroom, so that the teacher can pick up how well they're learning. And the actual strategies, if the teacher thinks about what strategies the pupils need to develop and understands those and discusses them with the pupils, then the pupil and the teacher can work together to develop appropriate strategies. Interestingly, you'll see the last line I've written there. Where schools have tried this and been unsuccessful is because single teachers are trying it. Where schools have tried this and been extremely successful is where, from the top of the school to the new teacher coming in, doesn't matter where you are in the sort of seniority within school, everybody talks the same language. Every subject has the same understanding of how they're going to use assessment according to a model that has been agreed. And therefore, when you change by age, you change by content, you change by subject, and you have slightly different practices, the understanding of assessment itself continues through the school. So the quality of conversation between all members of the school is consistent, and the practice is consistent, and then pupils can learn better. Thank you. Next slide. So here we are. This is it really. It's good quality assessment allows pupils to control their own cognitive processes and to learn about learning. In really good assessment practices, pupils and teachers, we remember anything to do with assessment is exactly the same as anything to do with learning. It has to be part of a cycle. You begin and you keep. It's working around. We plan to do something, we do it, we find out how to do it, we find out how doing it, and we develop as we do that. And I think we all do that. We don't always think about that when we're that we don't always do that at the beginning of our planning for assessment. We really do need pupils to really think about what do they know about the subject, what cognition is needed, what metacognitive knowledge, and what sort of metacognitive regulation do they need in their learning. So how do they promote their own learning? How do they refine the strategies? And I absolutely believe that when pupils are working in this way, they actually are very motivated to engage in learning. They develop strategies, they introduce new methods of learning, and it doesn't matter whether they are 4 years old, 10 years old, it doesn't matter where they sit in that education system. They really become more motivated when they understand that there are a variety of strategies, there are different processes, there are different tactics to use, and they can control their own learning. So assessment needs to sit towards achieving that. Next. Okay, so this one here, this slide here, we're kind of linking this here now to some of the things that Education Endowment has been talking about. You will have seen some of these appear in the Education Endowment framework for metacognition, and obviously these are things where we want pupils to improve their learning, want them to be self-regulated. So we think about what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, how do they know these, how do they motivate themselves, how do they improve their learning, how do they have a conversation with you as teachers to say, well, I've done this, but I now need to know more. And I, you know, as a practitioner, I've often had really good conversations with A-level students who will ask you quite deep questions about their learning, and you direct them. And I often find as you move to the younger age groups, they find it harder to articulate aspects of learning because they haven't always seen them modelled, and they haven't consistently seen them modelled, and they haven't had people expressing the language of learning in the classroom. So if assessment promotes that language of learning and promotes their ability to improve their learning and understand their learning, then I find that their pupils, even at a very young age, can talk about what makes them learn well. And interestingly, I've just been working with one of the hubs, and it was a preschool teacher I spoke to who has been working with scientific practice in the classroom, and pupils discovering what scientific practice is because they've been taking scientific roles within their learning. And so although they may not have the language that an A-level student would have, they actually have the understanding that different people have different roles in learning and investigation, so that, and those roles they can all hold, and therefore it starts building up their ability to use those processes. So really important that the assessment will allow people to see what the thought processes are, the teacher verbalizes their thinking around that, they measure that with the pupils, help the pupils to articulate their own processes, and then you can make assessments within the learning as to how well pupils are doing. Guide their practice, and then effective assessment will then support that. Next slide, please. So these are the things pupils need. They need to understand what the activities are, what the purpose of those activities are, what benefit are they getting, how are they going to use them in the future. They have to appreciate what the demands of learning are. You know, things should be difficult. They should have times where they find it hard and other times where they find it straightforward. But learning is a demanding process, and it's appropriate they should feel that demand without feeling fear alongside it. And that's where assessment will allow them to appreciate what the demands are and what they need to do. The assessment needs to engage the people rather than hand it to them. So it mustn't be owned by the teacher all the time. Some things have to be owned by the teacher, but not everything. And the more often the pupil can own the assessment as well as learning, the more often they will be able to promote their own learning more rapidly. We obviously want to develop cognition, we want to develop learning, and we want to develop an understanding of the subject. So we do need assessment to support that. We do need assessment to allow pupils to take action and ownership. And obviously the thing we want them to become is autonomous and self-regulating. Next slide, please. And here is just some examples of things that I've seen people using in that environment in order to measure learning, so that rather than taking the assessment away from the learning, the assessment is inside the learning. You'll see that they're not tests, they're not things that you would think, oh, that's an assessment for learning tasks. They are literally part of the teaching and learning. And so the assessment is within the learning, and because both pupils and teachers understand what it's measuring and what they're trying to achieve from it, they can use it well. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so we've reached that magic time, but we're going into breakout groups. And you can see what I want to do after the breakout group is hear from you, something that you can share back with the wider group, so one person from each group to share back. Now, I don't know if Aziz wants to step in there and direct people as to what's going to happen next, and then we'll come back. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I'm just about to put people into breakout rooms of around 5 to 6 participants. As Anne mentioned, it'd be great to kind of get your reflections and kind of takeaways on some of the points considered so far. And if somebody could feedback afterwards, I think Anne's kind of going to lead that session afterwards. We've set the time for 10 minutes, but we may pull you back slightly earlier depending on how we get on, but we'll send you into those breakout rooms now. Hopefully people should have, I think majority have moved. And I don't know if you would like to join a group at all. I can assign you to a group to observe.
I would quite like to just see what questions there are, if you just give me a moment to do that rather than going in. Still got 9 people not in rooms.
They've been invited to that. I don't think that they've clicked.
They might not be behind them. Yeah.
But they have been invited to join. The only people that are unassigned are yourself, Laura, and myself. Ella rejoining. I'll try and put Ella into a breakout room. Hi, Ella. I'm just going to try and assign you to a room now.
Yeah, it didn't let me join for some reason. Kicked me out. I'll try again.
Right. No problem. Yeah, I've tried to send you back into that breakout room. Hopefully you'll be able to join now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so there's only 2 things I can see sitting here as questions. One is about types of feedback and one's about taxonomy. So.
All of the groups have got at least 3 people in that have joined. Most have 4 or 5. They've had 3.
How many rooms?
Sorry.
How many rooms do we have?
We split it into 8 rooms.
Do they know which room number they're in?
They should do, yes. They'll have an assigned room at the top.
So if I ask for feedback from room 1, then room 1 will know who they are.
You should, yeah. I can egg that on if no one's willing to feedback, but
yeah, because you'll know where.
That's right. Yeah, I've got the rooms in front of me now.
Okay.
I think, like I said, I did set 10 minutes for the reflection, Anne. I don't know. We're 4 minutes in now. I don't know if you want to give them the full 10 minutes or potentially bring them back slightly earlier, but I can send a message to let the groups know if we are bringing them back slightly earlier.
Yeah, we'll give them, just give them a few minutes. They probably don't need the full 10 as they're quite small groups, but we'll bring them back in a couple of minutes, and then just aware of time. As I suspected, I talked longer than I planned.
Okay. I think I did send a notification that we'd be going up to 5:30 at the latest, so we do have that wiggle room to go towards.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm coming through clearly or not, because I'm dipping in onto a BT open network because a fox set the fiber cables away in the house today, so I'm not on the internet as normal.
Yeah, it's not been too bad, to be honest. One delegate did message me to say that they were finding it really difficult to hear, but nobody else has messaged that, so I assume that it was just from their end. It sounds fine from my end. There has been times when there's been a slight delay, and I don't know if you're also getting a delay on the slides, because I keep clicking.
Yeah, I'm getting a delay on the slides, and I'm also intermittently getting poor signal sign. But unfortunately, it's one of those. There's not. If it goes down completely, it'll have to be hot thingied off the phone. But as long as you can hear me, we're almost there anyway, so it's not.
Yes. No, like I said, it's been fine. There's been a few moments when it's lagged slightly, but nothing too substantial. So it should all be fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
They've had 6 minutes now.
Right, do you want to give them a warning and then get ready to bring them back out? I think that's probably.
Shall I give them another 60 seconds? Did you say?
Yeah, give them a minute's warning to that. It's about to close.
Just going to give them another couple of seconds, and then we'll bring them back into the main room. And I'll bring them all back now, and just so you know, okay?
Lovely.
Oh. Wait, I'll bring them back now.
This meeting is being recorded.
And we should have everyone back.
And then you can go back home.
Okay, I'll just click onto the next slide and oops. Yep. Shall I leave it on this slide for now?
Leave it there for a moment and we'll get some feedback first. Well, welcome back. I'm sorry it's quite a short time once you get talking, but it's really important that you have time in the middle of a meeting to talk. Also, apologies from myself if anybody's had delays in communication coming through, but I just was explaining to Aziz a fox set my wiring coming into the internet today, so I'm now attached to a BT open line, which obviously isn't as as good as normal fibre would be. So I was going to be on a really good fibre link, and I haven't got any fibre link at the moment. So so apologies if there have been some delays. I realised the slides were going a bit slow. You were in a room, so I'm going to ask one person from each room to please feedback. Hopefully you made that decision before coming back. If not, I'll ask Aziz to point somebody in my direction. So just really one key point that you think everybody across the whole of the meeting would like to hear. So room 1, have you got one point you would like to share with all of us, please?
I think that I was room 1, Anne, but you know, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Basically, I think it's just everyone's trying to move now towards assessment as learning, but that is really inconsistent, and it's yeah, quite difficult really. Antonio was talking about a DTT model of diagnosis, therapy and testing, based off Dunlowski research, which I hadn't heard of, but it sounds like a very similar thing to what I'm doing. But yeah, it is that modelling that needs to be done over and over, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
But it's just inconsistency.
Inconsistency, and that's always going to be,
yeah.
That's going to be the thing that causes, it's a success or failure factor, because it's interesting, when I show you in a minute one of the examples of one of our NACE schools of things they're doing, it's an example of something I've seen but has been dropped by many schools because it was being used inconsistently. And it's seeing if something's not used consistently in the school and people don't really understand why it's being used, it's really, really hard then to make a success in the school. So, you know, before you bring something in, think about how that can be consistently used across the school. Thank you. Group 2, room 2, please. Anybody from room 2?
Oh, yeah. We were talking about metacognition and how it's really great if everyone can kind of get on board with that, because there's the data to back up that it's actually pretty helpful and allows pupils to be more independent. But we're also saying that maybe it would be good to get some more kind of like concrete examples of how we could actually be using this in the classroom, because we're both quite like new teachers.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as I say, in a moment, I'll show you how one school has thought about this and is using it. And you may not think, actually, this is something that is metacognition. You may think this is something that's practice we've seen before, but it does, if it's used correctly, will develop metacognition. So hopefully the examples coming up will help you. Room 3, please. Was there anybody in room 3? No. Okay, can we want to move on to room 4 rather than waiting for room 3?
Hi, so we were thinking about obviously the importance of students reflecting on their own learning and how this might be affected by classroom culture, and we were discussing how to kind of create a classroom culture where students feel comfortable sharing ideas in front of their you know, peers, even if that means that they're making mistakes, and how, you know, social dynamics can play with that. So I suppose it was more a question than an answer of how to consistently establish a classroom culture where students feel comfortable having those conversations with each other and constantly being reflective of their own, you know, targets that they need to work on.
Thank you. Yes, and it'll be interesting because again, one of the 2 schools I show here, it was around the reason they brought practice in was because the social dynamic in the classroom didn't favour the best way of learning, and so they thought around how do we change the dynamic in the classroom. So that's an interesting point. Thank you. I think I'm on room 5 now, please. Forgot where I was. Anybody from room 5?
Yeah, so I think one of the points we discussed was about the purpose of assessments and really making sure that, which I think is something that we need to work on, about making sure all kind of departments consistently across the school are aware of why they are assessing and what's the purpose of it, and then sharing that with pupils so that they themselves are then able to take that independence in their learning. And because the purpose of assessment is not really known, it's not used as effectively. To sort of, you know, get a better outcome for the pupils and the teachers, really. So I think that's one area that we thought that, particularly for metacognition, it is about having that clarity in why we're using the assessment and what we hope to achieve from it.
Yeah, and this is a really important point. It's interesting you talk about all the departments, because actually some things that people often forget about is you bring something into a school and you try to work on it, and maybe senior leaders really understand it and they really know what they want to deliver, and they talk to people about delivering it and everybody delivers it, but they don't deliver it together with the same thought, because the actual thinking hasn't been discussed through before it goes into practice. And if we think about the subject leaders or the heads of department as being the sort of the workhorse, the sort of central force within a school making things happen, if that group of people really haven't got the language correctly, or they haven't got the practice correctly, when they then share that through the rest of the teachers, then you kind of get mixed messages and different departments start doing things differently and you can't get that consistency. So really the first big bit of work when you bring something like this in is to make sure, however you form your middle leaders group and however that is developed, then it's really, really important that all of those people working in that group have a common language, a common purpose, common understanding of the purpose, and common processes, not the same ones, because you can't, an English teacher and a science teacher are not going to use things in the same way. But if they've got the same principles and the same structures and the same understanding and they use the same language, then they have a real sense of consistency across the school and a real understanding of what the purpose of developing metacognition and assessment for metacognition is. So that's really important to share. Okay, next group then, number 6, please. No, number 6. Number 7? Anyone from room 7?
Yeah, we were talking particularly about students' ability to talk to one another in order to learn. One of the issues that I'm certainly experiencing is a lot of passivity from students, and it's not just myself; it's a school-wide issue. And I think one of the issues is they've perhaps got a bit too used to screen learning and the teacher standing at the front, waving their arms around and doing all the thinking for them. And so I do some strategies myself in my classroom where I ask certain questions in certain ways to try and get them to think. But as you were saying, if we don't do it all together, then we're not really doing it. So so I grabbed Teach Like a Champion even, which has a section on teaching students to speak to one another in an academic manner. And as an English teacher and not a science teacher, I use evidence very differently from the science teachers. So we have to, I think that's something we need to work on as a school, is to help students to learn how to talk very clearly to one another in such a way that they remove the fear. We were talking about fear, particularly in Key Stage 3, the fear of being a tall daisy and getting your head chopped off. If we give them the language that they're able to, or the sentence starters that they're able to start their ideas off with, then we give them the safety and take away the fear of being shot down for having an opinion, or for saying something in a slightly silly way, or fearing that they're going to say it in a silly way. So I think that's something that we certainly need to work on as a school, and as you say, all of us need to work on as a school.
And as you say, it needs to be modelled, because people don't naturally know how to say things, how to express themselves. And and it can be done with all ages. So Key Stage 3 is particularly a vulnerable age, just because of where you are, just how you feel about yourself. There's so much going on in your mind and body, and changing schools and everything else, that you're struggling anyway. But I've seen teachers working with quite young children, teaching them how to express themselves, and being quite initially very regimented about, we must begin our sentence this way, and it sometimes seems very silly when you begin, because we're all going to give a response which begins in this way. Well, obviously, as children get older, you don't have to quite do it like that, but we do need to model something of that nature, because a good response in English, as you say, is this. A good response in science is this. A good response in mathematics is this. And there'll be core elements which, as a school, you can agree about. It's some things, when we're thinking about cognitively challenging learning, I have some knowledge that I have already acquired in this subject. So I'm going to draw on that knowledge. So there's something around the way I speak is about the knowledge I have. There is some vocabulary that my teacher expects me to use because it is the correct vocabulary for the subject I'm using. And it's that formal vocabulary. And somebody actually, it's interesting, somebody said to me, sent a message up saying Bloom's taxonomy ? And, you know, teachers have used that for a long time to get the sophistication in thought and language. And it, you know, it still sits there, although it might be quite old, it still sits there at the center of lots of things. And, you know, if you have got nothing else, it's a really good, it's a good starting point. For some people, they will have moved well beyond just thinking of that in isolation, but it is a good starting point because it does structure some of the ways you use language and the way you think about processing. But then you've got that knowledge, you've got that language, and then there's something around, well, when I respond, what is it I'm trying to project information about? And what evidence do I have? And then do I have an opinion or a hypothesis? You know, in English and history, we might have an opinion on something. In science, we might have a hypothesis about something, but then we've got evidence to draw in. So where's the evidence coming from? And is it reliable, valid evidence, or is it evidence that has an opinion attached to it? So there are lots of things which are similar. So they're different in the way that they're different subjects, but they're very similar in the practice. And if the school decides which things they want, which things are most important in that conversation, then everybody can structure subject-specific use of language to develop that use of language, and in expectation that children will talk. And that's the thing. If you're right from the beginning, if you get them talking in year 7, you'll have them talking in year 11. You want to shut them up in year 11, won't you? That's the. But wouldn't it be nice if we were trying to shut them up when they're talking about the subject eloquently and in this sophisticated manner? And that would be great. If we were doing all our assessment through classroom dialogue, we would have won the battle of assessment completely. So there's a lot to learn. It would be fantastic, wouldn't it? It would be just, you know, no marking, no anything. We walk into a class, we have a conversation, we come out of the class and we know what people know, and we know what we need
back to ancient Greece.
Well, yeah, let's go back to it. If only we had the time and we didn't have an exam sitting at the end of it, but that's the side of that. Okay, so we've got one group left, I think, group 8. Have anything to add to the conversation before we move on?
Hello, in group 8, we were all at different points in the journey with this, but I think we agreed that it's that planning for the assessment as learning, being really clear and explicit with that in school and for the children. And I think in my school, we've worked really hard to create a group of children using our more able children, and they become our masters. We have mini master classes, which are led by the children, and other children in the school can sign up to those sessions at the lunchtime. So the children in school are seen as teachers, as experts, and they learn from each other. And then that has filtered through, we've seen in our school, that has filtered into the classroom, where children are far more articulate because they are aspiring to one day become a mini master and deliver those sessions to other children. So I think we've seen a big shift in that, from allowing children to learn from each other and then filtering and planning those opportunities in class lessons with the teacher facilitating and modelling and supporting that as well. The language and that in their delivery as teachers in class has been a real change, again, and also infectious to children in classrooms as well, who aspire to be in that position themselves. And you can see the shift in that when they communicate and talk in pupil to pupil conversation within lessons. And it's about that that planning for those opportunities to allow them to do that. That's been really positive for us.
Yeah, it's really good to hear you talk about this, because there's quite a few schools that I've come across now that are making use of the more able pupils as peer educators, but also as peer support, and also to get some of these ideas moving forward, because schools that have the benefit of a significant number of pupils that would be traditionally called more able inside the school, actually, once they have shared that knowledge about learning with those pupils, they as pupils are sharing it with others, and because they're beginning to model practice in their classroom. So it's almost that the culture begins to change because there's enough people part of that culture. And so the more we can get the pupils to understand what they can achieve and what they can take ownership of, and and having those leaders that can really get that to move forward, the better it is in terms of making that whole school change. So that's really, really useful, a really useful idea there. The other thing that I was asked before I move on to examples from our schools was around types of feedback. There isn't a sort of like, oh, well, this is the best feedback. And, you know, I obviously criticized the dirt feedback earlier, but that works for some people if the pupils understand why they're doing it. If it's just, oh, well, everybody in the school does this, and therefore we've got to give 5 minutes in the lesson for them to process something, or if it's something where, you know, I've seen lots of things where the teacher grades and the pupils grade themselves, but everybody just does it as a tick box exercise and don't know why they're doing it, then it doesn't do anything. If any activity you engage in is part of a planned process for assessment, a process which promotes learning, a process which develops metacognition, then it becomes effective. And as you see, the next slide's coming up of a school that is using a particular practice, then we can see something that's being used. Here come the examples, thank you. So here's an example. Toot Hill School is a well-established school, it's very successful. They were looking at feedback, and so it's very appropriate that we pick up on this and move forward from here. And here's an example. This is where they use their feedback straight away at the point of teaching, summary at the end of a phase of knowledge or assessment, and then to review, so away from the point of teaching, so they have some written comments. And you notice at the bottom, the purple pen is hugely valuable at all 3 stages. Now, I was in an environment where purple pens were being used for a short while. Middle leaders didn't really understand the purpose of it. They all used it differently. And then they said, well, purple pens don't really work for us, because they had picked up the current trend, but didn't really get under the skin of why they were using it in their school. Here at Toot Hill, they have the purple pen strategy fitted entirely within a whole school strategy. Next slide, please. Oh, something strange has happened.
Sorry, Anne, can you still see those slides?
Can't see the slides now. I can just see everybody.
Apologies about that. Hopefully that's back now.
Right, so here we have. So Toot Hill whole school approach. It sits inside a 5-point program which supports ambitious teaching and learning routines. I think on the right-hand side, I originally had a picture there, but never mind. They're using the purple pen to what they call uplift learning, to encourage active listening and to inform assessment. So they sit inside their program for teaching and learning, and they've done an awful lot of, oh, here comes the picture. I couldn't see that before. So this picture on the right-hand side of the slide, in every classroom all the time, have agreed it over a long period of time. They changed the way they did the feedback, they changed the use of purple pen, but the payback at the time was less time spent assessing and marking. So everybody understood there was going to be a payback for the teacher. So it wasn't going to be another new initiative which took people away from teaching and learning, but used up all their time. So that was the first step. Everybody, the middle leaders became engaged, all the middle leaders committed to it, so that in different classes they would get different activities, but for the same general purpose. Okay, we're going to slip through the next few slides quite quickly, if we could, please. And you see some examples of how this is used. So here we have, they give them their purposeful learning, which lots of you will already have seen, and they annotate that with their purple pens to see how they improve their learning. Next slide. Okay, well, listen to the teacher. It's their responsibility to write down some very key points that they need. So it makes them active listeners. So the teacher doesn't write everything down for them. The teacher might speak to them one-to-one or speak to the class as a whole, and they write down some key points which improve the quality of their learning. Next slide. then when they do some whole class feedback, so they're not marking all the individual pieces of work and giving each person an individual feedback. The pupils again have responsibility to respond to whole class feedback. So they write down the key things which are important for them personally to improve their learning. So if there's a whole range of feedback, and they then have to select the pieces of learning that are most relevant to them improving their work. And you can see this as examples in English. Next one, please. Once they have reached this, the point that they really understand it, they obviously then use the purple pen to assess and mark each other's work and to make comments on each other's work based on, and this is the important thing, they need to know what it is they're trying to learn, how they're trying to learn it, what will lead to it improving. So you can see how this was working in a well-established environment rather than just trying it out. It has to be part of everything that pupils do in order to be able to understand how to help each other. Next slide. Okay, the teacher obviously then, when they do get individual marking, they then can respond to the marking with their purple pens. And then obviously think that when the teacher feeds back to them, there's a lot more around asking questions. You know, what are you going to do next? What do you need to do next? What's the next step? You know, how did so-and-so feel? What do you think would happen? So questions which will, according to the subject, obviously lead, obviously your specialism, you can think of the question you might want to ask to develop the way in which they think, the more analytic. So as we spoke earlier, an English teacher would ask a different question to a science teacher, but there's still that idea of planning how to move forward. What's the question needs to be asked in order to move learning forward. So rather than telling them, oh, you didn't talk about this or you didn't ask that, it's a thinking question, you know. So have you thought about this, or can you explain this, or how does this happen? So something that makes them go back to the text, or go back to the science, or go back to the maths and think about what comes next and how to use vocabulary, obviously. Next slide. And here they gave us this example of how it might be used in maths, just so it doesn't all look very much like the humanities. So people here talking about the process of learning in mathematics. So things that they need, bits of information they need to know in order to respond to the question, things they need to remember, how they can improve their response. Next slide, please. Now, here we have a total contrast. Eggers School are piloting this. And it's interesting that, again, it's about getting pupils more engaged in their learning, improving the quality of learning, getting them to feel part of the process of learning, and improving, giving the teacher more time to understand the process of learning and the attainment of the pupils, but then understanding where interventions are needed, how pupils will know what that is. So you can see a lot of what they planned was for the teacher rather than for the pupil. But when it then goes into practice, you'll see it's about the pupil getting involved, because it's not just feeding back to the pupils, but feeding forward into future learning. So if we look at the next slide. Did I have a next slide on Eggers? Oh, yes, I did. So they have given the teachers books in order to record performance. So you could say, oh, it's just a mark book, but it's to understand how the learning loop will close. And you can see some of the things they use they're not modern things. I mean, they're still using www and EBI. So they're not, and this is where I say we don't have to change everything we do. We can use things we've got. It's the purpose we use them. So what they're trying to do is improve the way the teachers teach and the teachers' understanding of the teaching, but also the way the pupils learn and their understanding of their own learning, and therefore how they are moving their own learning forward. So you can see they have what they call feed up. so that it feed up, and we see this in lots of schools now because schools are using visualizers where you put an example of excellence, so that people actually know what excellent looks like in the context of their learning, an example of when objectives have been met. So where you can show pupils what the good thing looks like, and lots of schools use the previous year's successful outcomes to show a younger year what that might look like. And obviously here they're using it from within the class to say, well, this piece of work met the objectives because the following activities had been completed, the following skills were demonstrated, the following objectives were exposed. So they make that very clear. So they're feeding up the standard, lifting the bar for learning, and then they're feeding forward. And you see, I criticise dirt. Somebody's just asked what dirt is. Dirt is the expression used for pupils doing directed independent review of their learning. So they go back in once the work's been marked, spend time improving the quality of their work, responding to feedback, thinking about what comes next. When it's used well, it's used within the context of there's the actual term, directed improvement review task. When it's used well, it's used in a cognitive environment. When it's used badly, essentially pupils get a few jobs, basically just jobs to do, and they do the jobs and they finish with it. And I've seen it used badly often. It's just pupils basically wasting time for 10 minutes or 15 minutes in a lesson. Where it's used well, pupils are actually advancing their learning. So just picking up an activity that other people do doesn't make it a good activity. It's how you use it and why you think you're using it that makes it a good activity. And they're using it very successfully here because it fits as part of this raising the bar for learning. So feeding up, feeding forward to the next stage of learning, feeding back what has already been achieved and what needs to be achieved. Next slide, please. And I don't know how easily these are to read on the screen, but they will be, once you get the slides, it'll probably be easier to read. And again, you see, this is something that has been around for ages, almost some approach. So they, that we've seen many, many times. But you see it's against a feed up and feedback model. So things that when you feed up, things that people can do, try to do, how they can improve, feedback, things that still need to be addressed, things that people aren't doing well enough, the teacher needs to address, the pupils need to address. Next slide, please. And here we've got other things that people have said they've been using in order to improve the quality of teaching and learning. And you can see things you will have seen. I mean, the thing I wanted to really show tonight is you don't, to be a metacognitively aware school, to use assessment in a metacognitive environment to increase cognitive challenge in the school doesn't mean we have to buy into the latest Queer More trend or whoever wrote the latest book that everybody's read. It's to decide what we want to achieve for our pupils, how we're going to achieve it, how we're going to get them to that point of being able to understand and control their learning, and what assessment practices we need to put in place to make that work. So if you think about the assessment practices you have in place now, which of those are actually helping, which of those are just doing the job of reporting and basically being a set of checks and balances, and therefore may be necessary, but I'm not going to hit this mark of metacognition, but which ones could be tweaked to fit inside a philosophy for improving the quality of delivery of education, which focuses on cognition and cognitive skills, which focuses on developing pupils' metacognitive skills so that they can use that assessment process to advance their learning. Next slide, please. There we go. So that's my views as somebody who's leading on assessment this year, looking at research and development. All our work is, as I say, developed from a case study approach. So we actually are looking at very successful schools, working with more able youngsters, and what they do, how they achieve it. If you're involved with NACE, I mean, as I say, with one of our NACE colleagues has spoken earlier, there are quite a few of you here who know about NACE. If you're involved with NACE, you know that this network is really important to actually share that information. And you can see we've got the read more examples. I've moved into blogging around what's happening at the moment. I'm always interested to hear what's happening from other schools and to share that more widely. Thank you, Aziz. Have we got any more NACE slides here that I need to close with, or there we go.
There's just a few, I think, just involving kind of next steps to find out a little bit more about NACE.
Yeah, this just really lets you know who we are, where we are, and if you want to get to know more about us and get involved in some of the work we do, then here's the information. And obviously come out with the rest of the slides. Thank you. Thank you, Aziz.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was fantastic, and really appreciate your time this afternoon in terms of kind of sharing that detailed information, and hopefully it's given people a lot of food for thought, and I think really importantly some practical tips to take away there and kind of apply in your own setting and context. Conscious of time, if anyone does have any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to kind of get back to you maybe individually following this webinar. If you would like to find out more about the Brilliant Club as well, our Scholars Programme, and how we're kind of working with schools across the country, please do visit our website. You've got my contact details, hopefully, so you can contact me directly as well. Hopefully we can, I'm just going to stop sharing my slide.